Picture this, a conflict so vast, so enduring, that it spanned generations, reshaping kingdoms and forging legends that would echo through the centuries. The 100 Years' War wasn't just a war, it was a crucible of ambition, a chessboard where kings and commanders played for the highest stakes, and where ordinary men marched into the annals of history. This wasn't a single battle or even a dozen. It was a sprawling tapestry of campaigns, sieges, and marches that tested the limits of human endurance and ingenuity. And today, we're stepping onto that battlefield, not with swords, but with curiosity, to uncover the 25 most unforgettable marches and campaigns that defined this era. These weren't just military maneuvers, they were moments of brilliance, desperation, and sheer audacity that decided the fates of nations. Think of the sheer scale. Over 100 years of conflict, from the rolling fields of Crécy to the muddy chaos of Agincourt, from the fiery rise of Joan of Arc to the strategic masterstrokes that turned the tide of war. Each campaign was a story unto itself, a blend of logistics, leadership, and raw courage. Some were triumphs of strategy, where outnumbered forces defied the odds. Others were tales of tragedy, where ambition outpaced reality, but all of them shared one thing: they left an indelible mark on history, shaping the Europe we know today. So why do these marches and campaigns still captivate us? Perhaps it's the human drama at their core, the commanders who gambled everything, the soldiers who marched through hunger and frost, the towns that stood defiant against impossible odds. Or maybe it's the sheer spectacle of history unfolding, where a single decision could alter the course of a century. Whatever the reason, these moments are more than just dates in a textbook. They're windows into a world of struggle and triumph. And as we journey through these 25 defining campaigns, you'll see how the echoes of the 100 Years' War still resonate, not just in the borders of modern nations, but in the very way we understand war, leadership, and the relentless march of time. Ready to begin, let's step into the past together. To truly appreciate the campaigns that shaped the 100 Years' War, we need to step back and see the bigger picture. This wasn't just a random conflict, it was a collision of kingdoms, a struggle over land, power, and even identity. The roots stretched back centuries, tangled in royal marriages, broken treaties, and competing claims to the French throne. When Edward III of England declared himself the rightful king of France in 1337, he lit a fire that would burn for over 100 years. But this wasn't just about crowns and titles. It was about control of rich French lands like Gascony, which England had held for generations, and the growing tension between two nations forging their own identities. The war became a clash of military traditions. On one side, England's forces relied on the devastating power of the longbow, a weapon so effective it could punch through armor and change the course of battles. On the other, France's heavy cavalry, the famed knights in shining armor, symbolized medieval chivalry, but they soon found themselves outmatched by new tactics. This was also an era of innovation. Fortifications grew stronger, gunpowder began to appear on battlefields, and armies learned to move faster, live off the land, and adapt. Yet beyond the battles, the war was shaped by shifting alliances, political betrayals, and the sheer will of extraordinary individuals. Kings rose and fell. Commanders became legends, and through it all, ordinary soldiers and civilians bore the brunt of the fighting, their lives upended by sieges, raids, and the slow grind of war. This was the stage on which our 25 campaigns unfolded, each one a story of strategy, survival, and the relentless push for victory. Understanding this backdrop isn't just helpful, it's essential. Because these weren't isolated events, they were threads in a much larger tapestry woven together by ambition, necessity, and the unforgiving demands of war. The summer of 1346 marked a turning point in the Hundred Years' War, a moment when bold strategy and unshakable discipline collided with the fading ideals of medieval warfare. King Edward III's campaign leading up to Crécy wasn't just a military operation. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare and calculated risk. Imagine the audacity, an English army vastly outnumbered, landing on the coast of Normandy and marching inland, not to conquer cities but to provoke. Edward's goal wasn't occupation, it was humiliation. By raiding deep into French territory, he forced Philip VI to respond, luring the French into a battle on terms that favored England's revolutionary tactics. The march itself was a feat of endurance. Edward's men covered staggering distances, living off the land while evading larger French forces. They moved like shadows, striking towns like keen to sow chaos, then slipping away before the French could pin them down. This wasn't just mobility, it was a new kind of warfare where speed and unpredictability outweighed sheer numbers, and when Philip finally cornered them near the village of Crécy, the English didn't flee. They turned and prepared the ground like artisans crafting a trap. What unfolded next shattered the myth of knightly invincibility. Edward positioned his longbowmen on a gentle slope, their arrows notched, while dismounted knights stood ready with polearms. The French charged, their heavy cavalry bogged down by mud and a relentless hail of arrows. Wave after wave fell, their splendid armor no match for English discipline. By nightfall, the field was littered with the flower of French nobility, their banners trampled in the dirt. Crécy wasn't just a victory, it was a revelation. The English proved that terrain, timing, and the humble longbow could topple an empire's pride, but the campaign's true brilliance lay in its aftermath. Instead of pressing deeper into France, Edward marched north to besiege Calais, securing a strategic port that would remain in English hands for over 200 years. This was the hallmark of his genius, knowing when to stop, when to consolidate gains rather than overreach. The Crécy campaign didn't just win a battle, it rewrote the rules of war, signaling the rise of the common soldier and the twilight of chivalry's dominance on the battlefield. The fall of Crécy didn't mark the end of Edward III's ambitions. It was merely the opening move in a far grander strategy. With the French army shattered, Edward set his sights on Calais, a bustling port city that would become England's lifeline to the continent. But capturing it wouldn't be as simple as winning a field battle. What followed was one of the most grueling sieges of the Middle Ages, a test of wills that stretched nearly a year and reshaped the meaning of endurance in warfare. Edward's forces arrived at Calais in early September 1346, transforming the city into a prison of its own making. The English didn't storm the walls immediately. Instead, they built a fortified ring around Calais, cutting off all supply routes by land and sea. Wooden towers rose to overlook the city's defenses, while blockading ships patrolled the harbor, ensuring no grain or reinforcements could slip through. Inside the walls, the citizens faced an unthinkable choice: surrender or starve. As months passed, food stocks dwindled to nothing. Stories tell of people eating rats, then leather, then even grass scraped from between the stones of the streets. Yet still, the governor, Jean de Vienne, refused to yield, clinging to hope that King Philip would break the siege. That hope proved futile. French relief forces attempted multiple times to dislodge the English, but Edward's preparations were too thorough. His men had dug trenches, built palisades, and positioned archers to repel any attack. When Philip's army finally arrived in late July 1347, they found the English defenses unbreakable. After a half-hearted attempt to negotiate, the French king simply withdrew, abandoning Calais to its fate. The message was clear: no help was coming. What happened next became legend. With no options left, 6 of Calais' leading citizens, the burghers, volunteered to walk out of the city, nooses around their necks, offering their lives in exchange for sparing the townspeople. Edward, enraged by the prolonged resistance, initially demanded their execution, but his pregnant queen, Philippa, intervened, pleading for mercy. Her appeal worked, and the burghers were spared, a moment immortalized in art and literature as a symbol of sacrifice and unexpected compassion. The fall of Calais was more than a military victory. It was a geopolitical game-changer. For over 200 years, the city became England's gateway to Europe, a vital hub for trade and troop movements. Edward had secured not just a port, but a permanent foothold in France, one that would shape Anglo-French relations for generations. The siege also revealed a harsh truth of medieval warfare. Battles could be won in an afternoon, but sieges were wars of attrition, where hunger and despair were deadlier than any sword. And in the quiet courage of 6 burghers, we see the human cost behind the grand strategies of kings, a reminder that history isn't just about conquests, but the lives forever changed by them. By 1356, the English had perfected a brutal new form of warfare, the chevauchée. These weren't just raids, they were carefully orchestrated campaigns of terror, designed to cripple the French economy and shatter morale. And no one executed them more ruthlessly than Edward III's eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, better known to history as the Black Prince. At just 26 years old, he led a lightning strike from English-held Gascony deep into the heart of France, proving once again that speed and audacity could outmatch sheer numbers. The prince's army moved like a storm, burning crops, sacking towns, and leaving a trail of smoke visible for miles. His target wasn't just resources, it was French pride. By ravaging the countryside, he forced King John II to abandon cautious strategy and give chase. The French king, eager to avenge past humiliations, gathered a massive feudal host, confident this time would be different. But the Black Prince had no intention of fighting on their terms. When the armies finally clashed near Poitiers, he turned the French strengths into weaknesses. Positioning his men on a wooded hillside flanked by natural obstacles, the prince forced the French knights to attack uphill through narrow gaps in the terrain. His longbowmen, hidden among the trees, unleashed volleys that turned the charge into chaos. When the French dismounted to push forward on foot, they found themselves trapped in a deadly funnel, pressed together so tightly they could barely raise their swords. It was Crécy's lesson repeated. Feudal glory meant nothing against disciplined archers and clever ground. The real shock came in the battle's final moments. As the French lines collapsed, King John himself was surrounded, his bodyguard cut down. Rather than flee, he fought on until his sword was knocked from his hand, then surrendered to a lowly English knight. The capture of a reigning monarch was unprecedented, a humiliation that sent shockwaves across Europe. Ransomed for a staggering sum enough to fund England's war effort for years, John's captivity left France leaderless, bankrupt, and teetering on the brink of collapse. But Poitiers revealed more than just military genius. It exposed the fragility of feudalism itself. France's reliance on noble levies, bound by personal oaths rather than centralized command, couldn't match England's professionalized tactics. The Black Prince's chevauchée didn't just win a battle, it proved that warfare had changed forever. And in the smoldering ruins left behind, a question lingered. How much longer could kings cling to the old ways when the new ones kept leaving them in chains? By 1360, both England and France were exhausted. Years of chevauchées, sieges, and the staggering blow of Poitiers had drained treasuries and demoralized populations. The Treaty of Brétigny wasn't just a ceasefire, it was a desperate bid to catch their breath. On paper, it looked like a total English triumph. Edward III abandoned his claim to the French crown, but in exchange, he received nearly a third of France's territory outright. Calais, Gascony, Aquitaine, and more, all to be held without feudal obligation to Paris. For the first time, England's foothold on the continent wasn't just a collection of disputed fiefs, it was a sovereign empire. Yet the peace was built on quicksand. The treaty's fatal flaw wasn't in its terms, but in its assumptions. It treated land as something that could be neatly traded like chess pieces, ignoring the people who lived there. French peasants in Aquitaine had no say in suddenly becoming English subjects, and local nobles bristled at swapping allegiances overnight. Worse, both kings left key grievances unresolved. The French still seethed over the humiliation of Poitiers and the ransoms bleeding them dry, while Edward's son, the Black Prince, ruled Aquitaine with such heavy-handed arrogance that even his allies grew restless. The cracks showed quickly when the Black Prince levied crushing taxes to fund his lavish court in Bordeaux. Aquitaine's nobles appealed to Charles V, the new French king. Charles, a master of legal cunning, saw his chance. Instead of marching to war, he exploited a loophole. The treaty required certain territories to be surrendered by a fixed date, and when England missed deadlines, whether by accident or arrogance, Charles declared the agreement void. By 1369, both sides were back at war, but this time the French had learned their lesson. Bretigny's collapse revealed a truth no treaty could erase. Land could change hands, but loyalty couldn't be bought with parchment. The war's next phase wouldn't be decided by dramatic charges or heroic stands, but by patience, propaganda, and the slow, grinding work of reclaiming France inch by inch. And waiting in the wings was Charles V's secret weapon, a Breton knight named Bertrand du Guesclin, who knew how to fight a war without giving the English the open battle they craved. The pause was over, the game had changed. The war had already reshaped France, now it was about to spill across the Pyrenees, pulling Spain into its orbit. The Castilian intervention wasn't just a sideshow. It was a stark reminder of how dynastic rivalries could turn regional conflicts into continent-wide struggles. In 1366, the Black Prince found himself drawn into a vicious civil war between two claimants to the Castilian throne, Pedro the Cruel, backed by England, and his half-brother Enrique of Trastamara, supported by France. What began as a quarrel over a crown became a proxy battle for the future of the 100 Years' War itself. The Black Prince's campaign into Spain should have been a triumph. At Nájera in 1367, his forces crushed Enrique's army in a textbook display of English tactics, longbow volleys shredding enemy ranks, disciplined infantry holding the line. Pedro was restored to his throne, and for a moment it seemed England's influence would stretch from the Channel to the Mediterranean, but victory came at a hidden cost. The Castilian summer heat baked the land dry, and disease stalked the English camp. Dysentery ravaged the ranks, and the prince himself fell gravely ill, a sickness from which he'd never fully recover. Worse still, Pedro, nicknamed the Cruel for good reason, refused to pay the agreed-upon subsidies, leaving the English army stranded without funds or supplies. The real lesson of Nájera wasn't about battlefield glory, it was about the limits of power. The Black Prince's campaign exposed the risks of overextension. An army could win every battle and still lose the war. Marching hundreds of miles from friendly territory, dependent on unreliable allies and hemorrhaging men to attrition, the English found themselves trapped in a paradox. They were invincible in combat but vulnerable to the slow bleed of logistics and betrayal. Meanwhile, France's support for Enrique proved more strategic. Though defeated at Nájera, Enrique would eventually overthrow Pedro, securing Castile as a French ally and gaining access to Castilian naval power, which would soon harass English shipping lanes. This Spanish detour revealed something deeper about the war's evolution. No conflict could remain contained when kingdoms were bound by shifting webs of marriage, debt, and ambition. The Black Prince returned to Aquitaine weakened, his reputation tarnished by unpaid debts and his body failing. The campaign that began with chivalric pageantry ended in quiet disillusionment, a warning to all who thought victory on the field guaranteed lasting power. And as the prince's health declined, so too did England's momentum, leaving the door open for France's methodical resurgence under Charles V and his shadowy general, Bertrand du Guesclin. The chessboard was growing larger, and the price of every move was becoming dangerously unclear. Edward III's march to Rheims in 1359 wasn't just another campaign, it was a king's final bid to turn ambition into destiny. For over 20 years, he'd fought to claim the French crown, and now, with the Black Prince's victory at Poitiers still fresh, the moment seemed ripe. Rheims held the sacred oil used to anoint French kings, and capturing it would legitimize Edward's rule in the eyes of God and man alike. But what looked like a masterstroke on parchment collided with the brutal realities of medieval warfare: weather, logistics, and a French population no longer willing to bow without a fight. The English army landed at Calais that autumn, a formidable force bolstered by years of confidence. Yet from the start, nothing went as planned. Unseasonable rains turned roads to quagmires, slowing progress to a crawl. Supply wagons sank axle-deep in mud, and foraging parties returned empty-handed. French villagers had learned from years of chevauchés, burning their own harvests rather than let them feed the enemy. Even the land itself seemed to resist Edward's advance. By winter, his men were starving, their boots rotting off their feet, while the French adopted a strategy of shadow and steel. Rather than face the English head-on, garrison commanders barred their gates and scorched the earth, forcing Edward to waste precious time and men on fruitless sieges. Rheims, the glittering prize, became a mirage. When Edward finally reached its walls in December, the city refused to crack. Its defenses, strengthened in secret, mocked his battered siege engines. For weeks, the English camp shivered in the snow, their king's dream slipping away with each frozen breath. Meanwhile, French militia harried their supply lines, cutting off messengers and ambushing stragglers. The campaign's grand vision, a coronation amid the hallowed arches of Rheims Cathedral, dissolved into a grim calculus of survival. Retreat was the only option. By spring, Edward led his broken army back to Chartres, where a freak hailstorm killed men and horses in what many saw as divine judgment. With his treasury empty and his troops mutinous, he had no choice but to negotiate. The Treaty of Brétigny, signed that May, was a face-saving compromise, vast lands in exchange for dropping his claim to the crown. But the Rheims campaign's true legacy wasn't in parchment promises, it was in the lesson it seared into history. No matter how brilliant the strategy, war could be undone by the simplest of enemies: mud, hunger, and the quiet defiance of ordinary people. Edward had gambled everything on a single throw of the dice, and for the first time the house had won. France, bloodied but unbowed, had proven that even the mightiest campaigns could falter when met with patience, preparation, and the unyielding will of a nation refusing to vanish. The Breton Civil War was like a smaller, fiercer mirror of the 100 Years' War itself, a tangled web of inheritance disputes, shifting loyalties, and two great powers using local chaos to their advantage. When Duke John III of Brittany died in 1341 without a clear heir, rival claimants emerged: his half-brother John of Montfort, backed by England, and his niece Joan of Penthièvre, supported by France. What might have been a regional feud exploded into a 23-year struggle, with Brittany's ports and castles becoming pawns in the larger game between kingdoms. For England, backing Montfort wasn't just about territory, it was about securing a dagger pointed at France's flank. Brittany's coastline offered safe harbors for English ships, while its independence from Paris made it a perfect ally. France, meanwhile, couldn't afford to let this strategic peninsula slip into enemy hands. The war became a laboratory for new tactics, sieges decided by treachery rather than assault, raids that blurred the line between soldier and pirate, and a grinding stalemate where control of a single castle could shift hands a dozen times. The turning point came in 1364 at Auray, a battle that felt like a microcosm of the entire conflict. Montfort's forces, led by the ruthless English captain John Chandos, faced Joan's army under Bertrand du Guesclin, a French commander who'd spent years mastering the art of guerrilla warfare. But this time, there'd be no clever retreats or scorched earth. Both sides knew the war had to end. What followed was a brutal, close-quarters fight where discipline trumped numbers. Chandos's men held their formations, weathering cavalry charges, while du Guesclin, for all his brilliance, found himself captured, his army shattered. Auray didn't just decide Brittany's fate, it revealed how deeply the 100 Years' War had seeped into every crack of European politics. The victory secured the duchy for Montfort's son, but the cost was a lesson in unintended consequences. England's triumph here came just as its grip on Aquitaine was starting to slip, proving that even wins could stretch resources too thin. And for France, the loss was a wake-up call, one that spurred du Guesclin to refine his strategy, setting the stage for his relentless campaign to reclaim France piece by piece. Brittany's civil war had been a proxy battle, but its aftermath showed no conflict could stay contained. Every local feud, every castle taken, was another thread pulled in the unraveling tapestry of medieval Europe. Henry V's march to Agincourt in 1415 wasn't just a military campaign, it was a desperate gamble, a test of will against impossible odds. Freshly crowned and hungry to prove himself, Henry saw France as both his birthright and his proving ground. But what began as a bold invasion quickly turned into a nightmare of attrition. Landing in Normandy with 12,000 men, the English army found themselves bogged down by grueling sieges, their numbers dwindling from disease and desertion. By the time they limped toward Calais weeks later, they were a shadow of their former strength. Fewer than 6,000 starving, exhausted men, their uniforms caked in mud, their bellies hollow with hunger. The French, meanwhile, had assembled a force 3 times their size, confident this would be the battle to finally crush the English menace once and for all. What happened next defied every expectation. Trapped near the village of Agincourt, with rain turning the freshly plowed fields into a quagmire, Henry didn't panic. He turned the terrain into his greatest ally, positioning his archers on the flanks, their longbows strung and ready. He forced the French knights to advance through a narrow funnel of mud. The result was carnage. Armor-clad cavalry sank waist-deep in the mire, their horses flailing, while volleys of arrows rained down like hellfire. Those who reached the English lines found themselves trapped in a press of bodies so tight they could barely lift their weapons. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter, a grim testament to the lethal efficiency of disciplined archers against the lumbering pride of chivalry. But Agincourt's legacy wasn't just in its bloodshed. Henry's victory became a cultural touchstone, a story of underdog triumph so potent that Shakespeare immortalized it centuries later. The battle distilled the myth of English resilience, the idea that grit, ingenuity, and a touch of divine favor could overcome any disadvantage. Yet beneath the legend lies a darker truth. The campaign's aftermath saw Henry ordering the execution of thousands of French prisoners, a chilling reminder that medieval warfare had no room for mercy when survival was at stake. For all its glory, Agincourt was also a lesson in the brutal calculus of war, where even victory came drenched in mud and blood. What made Henry's march truly remarkable wasn't just the battle itself, but the sheer audacity of his retreat afterward. Instead of pressing deeper into France, he marched his battered army straight to Calais and sailed home, a king who'd gambled everything and lived to tell the tale. Agincourt didn't win the war, but it shattered French morale and cemented Henry's reputation as a warrior king. And in the centuries since, its name has echoed as both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder that sometimes, against all odds, the desperate and the determined can rewrite history with nothing but a longbow and a prayer. Henry V's conquest of Normandy wasn't just another military campaign. It was a masterclass in patience, precision, and the brutal mathematics of siege warfare. After the glory of Agincourt, Henry could have rested on his laurels. Instead, he set his sights on a far grander prize, not just winning battles, but reclaiming Normandy, the ancestral heartland of English kings. In 1417, he returned to France with an army built for endurance, not spectacle. This wasn't the lightning strike of a chevauchée. It was the methodical grind of a ruler determined to carve his legacy stone by stone. The key to Henry's strategy lay in his understanding of time as a weapon. While earlier campaigns had relied on speed and shock, Normandy demanded something different: relentless pressure. City after city fell not in dramatic assaults, but through starvation and suffocation. Take Caen, for instance. Its mighty walls had repelled invaders for centuries, but Henry's engineers isolated it with trenches and wooden forts, cutting off supply lines until surrender became the only option. Then came Alençon, Falaise, and finally Rouen, Normandy's wealthiest city. The siege of Rouen was a microcosm of the entire campaign's ruthlessness. For 6 months, the English tightened their grip, while inside the walls, civilians ate horses, dogs, and finally, according to chroniclers, even their own dead. When the gates finally opened in January 1419, it wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. Henry didn't just conquer, he made resistance seem futile. What set this campaign apart wasn't just its success, but its administrative brilliance. Henry didn't just take Normandy, he made it English. Castles were repaired and garrisoned with loyal troops. Local officials who swore allegiance kept their posts, creating a veneer of continuity. Even the church was co-opted, with English bishops installed to secure divine sanction for the new order. This wasn't the smash and grab of earlier raids. It was nation-building, a deliberate effort to make Normandy's occupation permanent. Yet for all its meticulous planning, the campaign's true significance lay in its psychological impact. Normandy's fall shattered the myth of French invincibility. If the birthplace of William the Conqueror could be taken, what safety was there for the rest of France? Henry's victory here marked the high tide of English power in France, a moment when the dream of a dual kingdom seemed within reach. But like all tides, this one would eventually recede. The very thoroughness of Henry's methods sowed the seeds of future strife. The cost of holding Normandy drained England's treasury, while the bitterness of occupation fueled French resistance. For now, though, the Lion of England roared unchallenged, his claws sunk deep into the land he believed was his birthright. By the winter of 1428, the English noose around Orléans had tightened to a stranglehold. The city was the last major obstacle blocking their path to total domination of France. Its fall would have opened the gates to the Loire Valley and beyond. For months, English siegeworks encircled Orléans, their cannon battering the walls, while French defenders clung to hope by their fingertips. The situation seemed hopeless. Then, in March 1429, a 17-year-old peasant girl from Domremy arrived at the French court with a claim that would alter history. She'd been chosen by God to save France. Joan of Arc's entrance onto the stage wasn't just unexpected. It defied every convention of medieval warfare. What followed was less a military operation than a spiritual revival. Joan's unshakable conviction cut through the despair like a sword through fog. Clad in white armor, carrying a banner emblazoned with holy symbols, she transformed the demoralized French troops into believers. Her genius lay not in tactical brilliance, though she displayed a sharp instinct for war, but in her ability to reignite a sense of divine mission. When she led a convoy of supplies into Orléans under cover of darkness, bypassing English blockades, it wasn't just food and weapons that reached the starving city. It was the electric spark of hope. The breaking of the siege unfolded like a script from legend. Joan personally led sorties against English strongpoints, her presence turning French attacks into crusades. At the fortified Tourelles, an arrow struck her thigh, yet she rallied her men to one final assault. As the English defenses crumbled, their commanders, men who'd spent lifetimes waging war, found themselves outmaneuvered by a teenager who'd never seen a battlefield before that spring. By May 8th, the siege was over. The English retreated in disarray, their aura of invincibility shattered. Orléans' liberation became the hinge on which the war swung. Joan's victory proved that the English could be beaten, not by matching their longbows or castles, but by something far more potent, the unbreakable will of a people fighting for survival. Within months, she escorted Charles VII to Reims for his coronation, legitimizing his rule in the very cathedral where French kings were crowned. Political impact was seismic. Suddenly, resistance to English rule wasn't just rebellion, it was holy duty. Yet Joan's story also reveals war's cruel irony. The same divine mandate that fueled her rise made her a target. Captured a year later by Burgundian allies of England, she was tried for heresy and burned at the stake, a martyr whose death only cemented her legend. The Siege of Orléans didn't just mark France's resurgence. It showcased how wars are won as much by symbols as by swords. And in Joan's brief, meteoric campaign, we see the paradoxical power of faith in battle, the ability of one voice, however improbable, to rally a broken nation and turn the tide of history. The liberation of Orléans was just the beginning. Joan of Arc's true genius lay in what came next. With the city secured, she turned her attention to the Loire Valley, launching a campaign that would rewrite the rules of French warfare. This wasn't about holding ground, it was about momentum, about striking while the enemy reeled. The English, still stunned by their defeat at Orléans, scrambled to regroup, but Joan gave them no breathing room. In a matter of weeks, she orchestrated a series of assaults that cleared the Loire of English strongholds, each victory compounding the last like falling dominoes. The first domino fell at Jargeau, a fortified town bristling with archers and artillery. Conventional wisdom said storming its walls was suicide, but Joan's army didn't fight by convention. She led the charge herself, scaling ladders under a hail of arrows, her banner fluttering above the fray. When the English commander tried to surrender, legend says she refused, not out of cruelty, but because she knew hesitation could cost lives. Jargeau's fall sent a message. The French weren't just resisting anymore, they were taking back their land one stone at a time. Next came Meung-sur, Loire and Beaugency, their garrisons collapsing under the weight of Joan's relentless advance. But the crowning moment came at Patay, where the English made their last stand in the valley. Here, the French cavalry did something unprecedented. They caught the legendary longbowmen unprepared. No prepared positions, no muddy terrain to slow the charge, just a thunderous clash of horsemen smashing into the English flank. The result was a rout so complete it erased the myth of English invulnerability. Chroniclers wrote of the field littered with arrows still in their quivers, of seasoned commanders fleeing in panic. Patay wasn't just a battle, it was a reckoning. What made the Loire campaign extraordinary wasn't just its speed, it was its psychological impact. For years, the French had fought defensively, reacting to English moves. Joan flipped the script. Every town reclaimed, every garrison scattered, chipped away at the aura of English dominance. Even more startling was her ability to unite a fractured nobility. Squabbling French commanders who'd spent years at odds now followed a peasant girl into battle, their rivalries momentarily silenced by the sheer force of her conviction. Yet for all its glory, the campaign also revealed Joan's limits. She was a spark, not a strategist. Her strength lay in inspiration, not logistics. The Loire victories restored French confidence, but they didn't win the war. That would take years of grinding sieges and political maneuvering. Still, in those few electrifying months, Joan achieved something priceless. She made France believe again. The English hadn't just been beaten, they'd been outmaneuvered, outfought, and most importantly, outbelieved. And in the shadow of those triumphs, a new question emerged. If a teenage girl could shatter an empire's grip, what else might be possible? Joan of Arc understood something deeper than battles. She knew the power of symbols. With the Loire Valley secured, she set her sights on a far more audacious goal, marching straight into the heart of enemy territory to crown Charles VII at Rheims. This wasn't just a military maneuver, it was a masterstroke of political theater. Rheims Cathedral was where French kings were anointed with holy oil, a ritual that transformed men into monarchs in the eyes of both heaven and the people. For Charles, whose legitimacy had been questioned for years, this coronation wasn't just ceremonial, it was existential. The march to Rheims defied every rule of conventional warfare. English and Burgundian forces controlled much of the route, and the roads were lined with hostile garrisons. Yet Joan's army moved with an almost supernatural confidence, as if her very presence dissolved resistance. City after city, Auxerre, Troyes, Chalons opened their gates without a fight. Their governors swayed as much by her reputation as by the growing crowds of peasants rallying to her banner. Even the weather seemed to bend to her will. Chroniclers noted unseasonably clear skies, as though nature itself blessed the campaign. By July 16th, just 3 weeks after leaving Orléans, Joan stood in Rheims Cathedral, watching as Charles knelt to receive the crown. The moment was electric. For the first time in decades, France had a king whose right to rule felt ordained not by treaties or bloodshed, but by divine providence. The strategic impact was immediate. Charles's coronation didn't just bolster morale, it rewrote the map of loyalty. Towns that had hedged their bets now declared for the newly crowned king, while English claims to the throne rang hollow in comparison. The campaign also exposed a critical weakness in England's hold on France. They could occupy castles, but they couldn't manufacture legitimacy. Joan had given the French something their enemies couldn't replicate: a story, a sacred narrative of deliverance that turned a fractured rebellion into a national crusade. Yet the Coronation Campaign's brilliance also contained the seeds of Joan's undoing. Her success made her indispensable, but it also made her a target. The English, humiliated by the spectacle of Charles's anointing, doubled their efforts to discredit her. Even some French nobles, uneasy at owing their salvation to a peasant girl, began to distance themselves. And Joan, now hailed as a living saint, found herself trapped by her own legend, expected to perform miracles on demand, her every move scrutinized for signs of divine favor. The road to Rheims had been a triumph, but it led inexorably to a harder truth. In war, even the most dazzling victories are just preludes to the next battle. The euphoria following Charles VII's coronation at Reims couldn't last forever. By August 1429, Joan of Arc stood outside the walls of Paris, facing a sobering truth: divine favor didn't guarantee victory against cold, hard stone. The French capital had been under English control for over a decade, its defenses reinforced with ditches, towers, and a garrison of hardened veterans. Joan, still riding the high of her Loire Valley triumphs, believed Paris would fall like the others, that her presence alone would make its gates swing open. But this time, the miracle didn't come. The assault began on September 8th, the feast day of the Virgin Mary, a date Joan likely chose for its symbolic power. French troops threw themselves at the Porte Saint-Honoré, their ladders scraping against walls slick with rain. Joan, as always, led from the front, her banner visible in the thickest fighting. But the English and their Burgundian allies had prepared. Crossbow bolts rained down from the ramparts, while makeshift barricades funneled attackers into killing zones. Then came the moment that shattered the legend's invincibility. A bolt from a Burgundian archer struck Joan in the thigh, sending her crashing into the mud. As blood soaked through her white armor, the French attack faltered. By nightfall, Charles ordered a retreat. Paris revealed the cracks in Joan's campaign. The city's population, weary of war, showed none of the enthusiasm that had greeted her elsewhere. Many Parisians still supported the Duke of Burgundy, England's ally, and viewed Joan not as a liberator but as a dangerous fanatic. Even nature seemed to turn against her. The late summer rains swelled the Seine, making approaches treacherous and dampening the gunpowder for French cannons. More critically, Charles himself hesitated, his advisors, nervous about overextending and eager to negotiate with Burgundy, withheld full support. Without the king's unwavering backing, Joan's army lacked the numbers and supplies to sustain a prolonged siege. Yet the failure at Paris didn't erase what Joan had already achieved. In just 6 months, she'd lifted the siege of Orléans, crushed the English at Patay, and made Charles's coronation possible, 3 feats that had seemed impossible before her arrival. Her campaigns proved that English dominance wasn't inevitable, that morale could outweigh material. Paris showed her limits, but it couldn't undo the psychological shift she'd ignited. The French now fought with something they'd lacked for decades: the belief they could win, and though Joan's personal star would soon dim, captured the following spring by Burgundian forces, her legacy outshone any single setback. The war's momentum had turned, not because of treaties or tactics, but because a peasant girl from Domremy made a nation remember its own strength. By the spring of 1430, Joan of Arc had become both a beacon of hope and a marked woman. The Compiègne campaign would be her last, a chaotic, desperate struggle that underscored how quickly fortune could turn in medieval warfare. The town of Compiègne, a loyal French stronghold on the Oise River, found itself besieged by Burgundian forces, England's key allies. Joan, ever drawn to where the fighting was thickest, raced to its defense with a small band of volunteers. What followed wasn't the triumphant liberation of Orléans or the sacred march to Reims, but a gritty, unglamorous fight for survival. The battle unfolded with a cruel irony. Joan led a bold sortie from Compiègne's gates, aiming to disrupt Burgundian siege lines. At first, the attack seemed to work. Her troops pushed forward, driving the enemy back. But then, disaster struck. The Burgundians, reinforced by fresh troops, counterattacked with brutal efficiency. The French found themselves trapped outside the city walls as Compiègne's defenders, fearing an enemy rush, abruptly raised the drawbridge. Stranded on the riverbank, Joan fought furiously until a Burgundian archer dragged her from her horse. In an instant, the girl who had crowned a king became a prisoner of war. Her capture laid bare the fragility of medieval command. Joan's brilliance had always been her ability to inspire, to turn frightened men into believers. But inspiration couldn't hold a bridge or reload a crossbow. Compiègne revealed the limits of charisma in the face of cold, hard logistics. It also exposed the shifting allegiances of the war's final phase. The Burgundians, once staunch English allies, were already secretly negotiating with Charles VII. Joan's imprisonment became a bargaining chip in a larger political game. Her fate weighed against territory and truces. Yet even in defeat, Joan's influence grew. The English, terrified of her symbolic power, rushed to try her for heresy, hoping to discredit her miracles as witchcraft. But martyrs don't fade, they crystallize. Her fiery death at Rouen in 1431 didn't erase her achievements, it immortalized them. The Compiègne campaign, though a military failure, became the crucible of her legend. Because sometimes the most enduring victories aren't measured in land taken or battles won, but in the unshakable idea that one person's courage can change the course of history. And in that, Joan's final campaign succeeded beyond anyone's reckoning. The year 1435 marked a turning point so subtle yet so profound that its echoes would shape the final decade of the 100 Years' War. While swords and sieges had dominated the conflict for generations, the Treaty of Arras proved that a well-timed stroke of diplomacy could achieve what armies could not, breaking the spine of England's continental ambitions. For decades, the Duchy of Burgundy had been England's most powerful ally, its wealth and military might tipping the balance in countless campaigns. But Charles VII, once derided as the King of Burghers for his limited realm, now saw an opportunity to pry loose this critical alliance with patience and pragmatism rather than brute force. The secret lay in understanding what Burgundy truly wanted. Duke Philip the Good hadn't joined the English out of loyalty. He'd been driven by vengeance after his father's assassination by Charles's faction years earlier. But time had dulled the edge of that anger, and Philip's ambitions leaned more toward expanding his own territories than propping up England's fading dreams. Charles's diplomats dangled irresistible concessions: full pardon for the assassination, key cities like Auxerre and Macon, and most crucially, exemption from homage to the French crown. This last point was revolutionary. It made Burgundy virtually independent, a kingdom in all but name. In exchange, Philip agreed to abandon England and recognized Charles as the rightful king of France. The geopolitical shockwaves were immediate. England, already strained by the loss of Normandy and Joan of Arc's resurgence, now faced a nightmare scenario. Their richest ally had switched sides overnight. Without Burgundian funds, troops, and just as critically, access to the vital Low Countries trade routes, England's war machine began to sputter. The treaty also exposed a flaw in England's strategy. They'd built their empire on temporary alliances rather than lasting loyalty. Once Burgundy withdrew, other wavering regions followed, peeling away like layers of an onion. Yet Arras was more than just a realignment of allegiances. It showcased Charles's emerging mastery of statecraft. Where his predecessors had relied on battlefield glory, he wielded parchment and promises like weapons. The treaty didn't just isolate England, it legitimized Charles's rule in the eyes of Europe, transforming him from a disputed claimant to the uncontested sovereign. And in a delicious twist of irony, the same diplomatic channels that had once sealed Joan of Arc's fate now became tools for France's resurrection. The lesson of Arras resonates far beyond medieval battlefields. Wars aren't won by valor alone, they're shaped by the quiet negotiations in candlelit chambers, by understanding an enemy's desires better than they do themselves. Charles's triumph here didn't just set the stage for France's reconquest. It redefined what victory looked like in an age where crowns could be bought with treaties as surely as with blood. By 1449, the tide of the Hundred Years' War had shifted irrevocably. Charles VII, once a king without a kingdom, now commanded an army transformed by discipline, technology, and the bitter lessons of decades of defeat. Normandy, the ancestral heartland of William the Conqueror, held by England for over 30 years, was next in his sights. What followed wasn't just a military campaign. It was a meticulously orchestrated reclamation, a showcase of how France had learned to fight smarter, not just harder. The French offensive began with a masterstroke of deception. While English commanders braced for attacks on traditional strongholds like Rouen, Charles's forces struck where least expected smaller towns with weak garrisons. Pont-d'Arloche fell first, its walls crumbling under concentrated cannon fire. Then came Verneuil, Argenton, and Lycia, each surrender chipping away at English morale. This wasn't the plodding siege warfare of old. It was a blitzkrieg centuries ahead of its time, leveraging speed, surprise, and overwhelming firepower. French gunners, now experts at breaching medieval walls, reduced fortresses that had once held out for months in a matter of days. The campaign's climax came at Formigny in April 1450, a battle that would redefine European warfare. English troops dug into their classic defensive positions with longbows ready, expected another Agincourt, but the French had adapted. Instead of charging headlong into arrow storms, they unleashed their secret weapon, artillery. Two massive cannon, positioned just beyond bow range, pounded the English lines with terrifying precision. When the English foolishly abandoned their defenses to seize the guns, French cavalry swooped in from the flanks, cutting off their retreat. The result was slaughter. Nearly 4,000 English soldiers fell, their famed longbows useless against the new reality of gunpowder dominance. Formigny wasn't just a victory, it was a revelation. The battle proved that the era of the longbow was over, replaced by the thunder of cannon and the coordinated tactics of a professional army. Charles's reforms, from standing troops paid by the crown to standardized artillery units, had borne fruit. Within months, the last English strongholds in Normandy, Cherbourg, and Caen capitulated. The reconquest was so complete that chroniclers noted how quickly Norman towns reverted to French allegiance, as if 3 decades of English rule had been a fleeting dream. Yet the true brilliance of the Normandy campaign lay beyond the battlefield. Charles understood that winning hearts was as vital as winning sieges. His troops were under strict orders to respect local customs and property, a stark contrast to the pillaging of earlier wars. Norman nobles who switched sides were pardoned, their lands restored. This wasn't mere mercy, it was statecraft, a calculated effort to heal the fractures of occupation. By the time the French banner flew over Rouen again, Normandy wasn't just conquered, it was reintegrated, a lost province returning to the fold. The fall of Normandy marked more than a territorial shift, it exposed England's fatal overextension. Without their continental foothold, the English crown's dreams of a dual kingdom evaporated. The campaign also showcased something far more enduring, the birth of the modern state. Charles's success relied not on feudal levies or charismatic leaders, but on centralized funding, trained specialists, and technological innovation, the very pillars that would define European armies for centuries to come. In the end, Normandy's reconquest wasn't just about reclaiming land. It was about the dawn of a new era where kingdoms would rise or fall not by the strength of their archers, but by the sophistication of their systems. By 1451, only one jewel remained in England's tattered continental crown, Gascony. For over 3 centuries, this sun-drenched corner of southwest France had been England's gateway to the continent, a land of vineyards and bustling ports like Bordeaux that poured wine and wealth into London's coffers. But Charles VII, fresh from his Normandy triumph, now turned his gaze south. What followed wasn't just the last act of the 100 Years' War. It was a brutal demonstration of how warfare itself had changed forever. The Gascon Campaign began with a masterful display of psychological pressure rather than brute force. Charles knew the region's loyalty was divided. Many Gascon nobles still remembered their English ties fondly. So instead of rushing headlong into battle, he sent envoys ahead, offering pardons and privileges to those who switched sides. Town after town, Bergerac, Périgueux, even the mighty fortress of Fronsac, fell with barely a fight, their gates opened by disillusioned locals or ambitious defectors. Bordeaux itself, the crown jewel, held out longer, its merchants fearing the loss of their lucrative English trade. But when French artillery rolled into view in June 1451, even the proud city's resolve crumbled. The English garrison, outnumbered and outgunned, sailed home without a decisive battle. Yet the war had one final, bloody surprise in store. In 1453, England made a desperate last gamble, sending veteran commander John Talbot to retake Bordeaux. The Gascons, chafing under French taxes and eager to restore their English trade links, rallied to his banner. For a few heady weeks, it seemed the tide might turn until Talbot's army met the French outside Castillon on July 17th. What happened there wasn't just a battle, it was a slaughterhouse of obsolete tactics meeting modern firepower. The French had prepared the field like artisans crafting a death trap. Their camp was a fortress of trenches and palisades, studded with over 300 cannon, a concentration of artillery unprecedented in medieval warfare. When Talbot's men charged, they weren't met with the usual hail of arrows, but with rolling thunder. Cannonballs tore through ranks at point-blank range, while hidden culverins, smaller, mobile guns flanked the English and raked them with shot. The legendary Talbot himself, an octogenarian still fighting with the fervor of his youth, was found dead beneath a pile of corpses, his horse felled by a gunshot. By sunset, nearly 4,000 English soldiers lay dead or dying, their longbows useless against the new age of gunpowder. Castillon's aftermath was as decisive as it was merciless. Bordeaux, stripped of hope, surrendered 3 months later. The English, their treasury empty and their people war-weary, made no further attempts to reclaim their lost territories. The Treaty of Picquigny in 1475 would formally end hostilities, but in truth, the war had died on that smoky field at Castillon. What made this final campaign so transformative wasn't just the territory changed hands, it was the unmistakable signal it sent. The French victory at Castillon didn't just end a war, it announced a revolution. The era of the armored knight and the yeoman archer was over, replaced by the cold mathematics of artillery and the disciplined ranks of professional infantry. Charles VII's reforms, standing armies, centralized funding, and relentless technological innovation had birthed the modern state's military machine. And as the smoke cleared over Gascony, one truth stood undeniable: the world would never go to war the same way again. The 100 Years' War wasn't just fought by kings and knights, it was shaped by the ruthless, ever-shifting allegiances of mercenaries, men who sold their swords to the highest bidder and turned warfare into a profit-driven enterprise. Among them, none were more feared or infamous than the free companies, bands of battle-hardened soldiers who roamed Europe like wolves, leaving scorched earth and shattered alliances in their wake. These weren't patriotic warriors fighting for crown or country. They were entrepreneurs of violence, and their presence added a volatile, unpredictable edge to every campaign. Picture the scene: a French village already battered by years of war, suddenly facing not just enemy troops, but roving bands of mercenaries who saw plunder as their rightful pay. The free companies operated like mobile criminal syndicates, extorting towns for protection, burning fields to force surrender, or even switching sides mid-battle if the opposing offer was sweeter. Their brutality was legendary. At Brétigny in 1362, a mercenary army defeated a French royal force not through superior tactics, but sheer terror, their reputation alone causing panic before the first arrow flew. Yet for all their savagery, these mercenaries weren't mindless thugs. Many were seasoned professionals, masters of siegecraft and guerrilla warfare. The Great Company, one of the most notorious bands, included veterans from every corner of Europe, dispossessed knights, exiled Genoese crossbowmen, even former English longbowmen who'd grown tired of their king's empty promises. What united them wasn't nationality, but necessity. In a war where pay was often late or non-existent, mercenaries took matters into their own hands, carving out fiefdoms in the chaos. Their impact went beyond the battlefield. Kings hated relying on them but couldn't win without them. When the Black Prince needed troops for his Spanish campaign, he turned to mercenary captains. When Charles VII rebuilt the French army, he absorbed entire companies into his new standing force, not out of trust, but because disbanding them would unleash anarchy. The mercenaries' greatest legacy might be the pressure they created for reform, pushing Europe toward professional armies simply because the alternative, unchecked bands of sellswords, was too horrifying to contemplate. In the end, the free companies embodied the war's darkest truth. That conflict, once unleashed, could become its own economy, feeding on itself long after the original causes faded. They were both symptom and accelerant of the era's instability, a reminder that when loyalty has a price, even victory can taste like ashes. The longbow wasn't just a weapon, it was a revolution carved from yew wood. When English archers first unleashed their volleys at Crécy in 1346, they didn't just kill French knights, they shattered an entire way of war. These 6-foot bows, requiring years of training to master, could fire arrows capable of piercing plate armor at 200 yards, turning the battlefield into a killing field. The secret wasn't just the bow's power, but the system behind it. English villages mandated archery practice every Sunday, creating generations of yeomen who could lose 15 aimed shots a minute. Against this storm of arrows, the lumbering charges of French nobility became suicidal. The longbow didn't just win battles, it democratized warfare, proving that a peasant with a cheap bow could topple a nobleman worth a kingdom's ransom in armor. Yet for all its dominance, the longbow's reign had an expiration date. By the mid-15th century, a new technology was rumbling across European battlefields: gunpowder. Early cannons, once unreliable novelties, evolved into siege-breaking monsters. At Castillon in 1453, French artillery batteries didn't just defeat the English, they annihilated them, their cannonballs cutting through formations like scythes through wheat. Guns changed the calculus of war in ways even the longbow couldn't. Where archers needed strength and skill, gunpowder weapons required only basic training, shifting the advantage from elite specialists to mass conscripted armies. Fortresses that had stood for centuries crumbled under sustained bombardments, rendering the towering stone castles of the Middle Ages obsolete almost overnight. The psychological impact was just as profound. The thunder of cannons didn't just kill, it terrified. Chroniclers wrote of men driven mad by the noise, of horses bolting in panic at the smell of sulfur. Gunpowder stripped warfare of its last vestiges of chivalric romance, replacing the individualized glory of the knight with the impersonal efficiency of industrialized death. Even the longbow's famed arrows, once the scourge of nobility, now seemed quaint beside weapons that could reduce a castle gate to splinters from half a mile away. But the most revolutionary shift wasn't in the weapons themselves, it was in who controlled them. Kings, not feudal lords, could afford the expensive new arsenals, centralizing military power as never before. The 100 Years' War began with private armies led by dukes and barons. It ended with the birth of the modern state's monopoly on violence. In this sense, the war's greatest legacy wasn't any single battle, but the irreversible shift from the medieval world of personal combat to an era where technology dictated the rise and fall of empires. The longbow had dethroned the knight, but gunpowder dethroned the very idea of war as a nobleman's game, and in that smoke-filled transition, the seeds of modern warfare were sown. Great commanders don't just lead armies, they shape eras. The 100 Years' War produced some of history's most unforgettable leaders, each leaving their fingerprints on the conflict in ways that transcended battlefields. Take Edward III, the architect of England's early dominance. His genius wasn't just in winning battles, but in rewriting the rules of war itself. At Crécy, he turned the French cavalry's pride against them, using terrain and disciplined archers to humble an empire. Yet for all his tactical brilliance, Edward's fatal flaw was overreach. His doomed march to Rheims proved even the boldest vision could crumble against mud, hunger, and time. Then there was his son, the Black Prince, a warrior whose very name struck terror into French hearts. He fought with the calculated ferocity of a chess master, turning chevauchés into psychological weapons and crushing France's nobility at Poitiers. But his Spanish campaign revealed the limits of his prowess. Victories on the battlefield couldn't compensate for poor alliances or the slow bleed of disease. The prince's story is one of paradox, a commander unbeatable in combat yet undone by the very ambition that made him great. Henry V brought a different kind of leadership charisma fused with ruthless pragmatism. His Agincourt campaign was a masterclass in turning desperation into legend, transforming starving, rain-soaked men into an unstoppable force. But Henry's true legacy lay in Normandy, where he swapped spectacle for patience, methodically conquering and governing territory with a statesman's touch. His early death robbed England of its most capable ruler, leaving his gains to unravel under weaker hands. And then there was Joan of Arc, the outsider who defied every convention. Unlike the kings and princes, she wielded no royal blood or trained armies, just an unshakable conviction that rallied broken men to miracles. Her leadership wasn't about tactics but transcendence, turning the war from a squabble over land into a sacred crusade. Yet her meteoric rise also exposed the fragility of faith-based command. Without institutional backing, her influence burned bright but brief, a flame extinguished by political betrayal. These commanders shared one haunting truth: no amount of brilliance could outlast the war's relentless grind. Edward's victories faded with his treasury. The Black Prince's health failed with his ambitions. Henry's conquests outlived him by mere decades, and Joan's divine mission ended at the stake. Their stories remind us that leadership in war is as much about legacy as it is about moments of glory, and that even the greatest figures are ultimately at the mercy of the tides they try to command. The 100 Years' War wasn't just a clash of kings. It was a slow-motion disaster for the people caught in its path. While chroniclers recorded the deeds of nobles and knights, the real suffering unfolded in the villages, fields, and cramped streets where ordinary lives were ground into dust. Imagine a peasant family hearing the distant thunder of hooves, knowing that within hours their world could vanish in smoke. Armies, whether French or English, lived off the land, and living off was a polite term for systematic theft. Crops were torched to starve enemies, livestock slaughtered for a single night's feast, and homes dismantled for firewood. Even in times of truce, mercenaries, unpaid and unrestrained, turned into roaming bands of predators, leaving behind trails of shattered communities. The war's true weapons weren't just longbows or cannons, but hunger and disease. Sieges transformed cities into charnel houses. In Rouen, during Henry V's brutal blockade, residents resorted to eating rats, then stray cats, and finally the unthinkable corpses. Dysentery, typhus, and the Black Death stalked armies and refugees alike, thriving in the squalor of crowded camps and displaced populations. The devastation was so complete that tax records from Normandy show entire parishes wiped off the map, their fields reverting to wilderness for lack of hands to till them. Yet amidst this bleakness, glimmers of resilience flickered. Towns like Orléans, battered by years of siege, rebuilt their walls and livelihoods with stubborn determination. Peasant revolts like the Jacquerie of 1358 erupted not just against foreign invaders but against local lords who squeezed their subjects dry to fund the war. These weren't just acts of desperation. They were assertions of humanity in the face of a conflict that treated civilians as collateral. The war's legacy wasn't merely territorial shifts or dynastic changes. It was a scar on the collective memory of a generation. Folktales sprouted like wildflowers in the ruins, warning children of the dangers of armies or celebrating cunning villagers who outwitted marauding soldiers. The suffering reshaped societies, accelerating the decline of feudalism as survivors questioned why they owed loyalty to lords who couldn't protect them. In the end, the 100 Years' War taught a brutal lesson: that the grand strategies of kings were paid for in the coin of ordinary lives, and no victory could ever truly justify the cost. The 100 Years' War didn't just end in 1453, it left fingerprints on history that would never fade. What began as a dynastic squabble over crowns and territory became a forge that reshaped nations, armies, and even how people saw themselves. Take national identity. Before the war, a French peasant might feel more loyalty to a local lord than to a distant king in Paris. But decades of English chevauchés burning villages, slaughtering livestock, created something unexpected: a shared sense of Frenchness, a collective resistance to the invader. The same happened in England, where victories like Agincourt became cultural touchstones, symbols of underdog triumph woven into the national psyche. The war didn't just draw borders, it drew the lines between us and them. Military tactics underwent a revolution just as profound. The dominance of the longbow at Crécy and Agincourt spelled the end of the knight's battlefield supremacy, proving that disciplined commoners could topple nobility with well-aimed arrows. But the war also birthed the gunpowder age. French cannons at Castillon didn't just win a battle, they heralded the future of warfare. Sieges, once grueling slogs, became artillery duels. Armies evolved from feudal levies to professional forces, paid by central treasuries rather than personal oaths. The mercenaries who once roamed like wolves were absorbed into standing armies or crushed by kings who now held monopolies on violence. War stopped being a nobleman's game and became a state's instrument. Politically, the war redrew the map of Europe in ways that still echo. England's dream of a continental empire evaporated, forcing it to look westward, planting the seeds for future naval dominance and colonial ventures. France, nearly shattered early in the war, emerged as a centralized monarchy, its king's authority unchallenged by once powerful dukes like Burgundy. The papacy, entangled in the conflict, saw its prestige erode as nations prioritized sovereignty over papal mediation. Even concepts like taxation and citizenship transformed, as kings needed new ways to fund their armies and populations demanded rights in exchange for loyalty. Yet perhaps the war's most enduring lesson is its unpredictability. For over a century, victory swayed like a pendulum, English longbows humiliating French knights, only for Joan of Arc's faith to reverse the tide, only for gunpowder to rewrite the rules once more. The conflict became a case study in adaptation. Those who clung to tradition, like the French at Agincourt, met ruin, while innovators, whether Edward III or Charles VII, reaped the rewards. It's a reminder that war isn't just about strength or numbers, but the ability to change before change is forced upon you. And in that turbulence, we see the birth of the modern world, one where nations, not dynasties, shape destiny, and where the art of war is forever a dance between the lessons of history and the shocks of the new. From Crécy's rain-soaked fields to the smoke-choked carnage of Castillon, these 25 campaigns weren't just battles. They were the hinges of history, moments where the fate of nations swung on the choices of kings, the courage of commoners, and the relentless march of innovation. The 100 Years' War didn't just reshape France and England. It rewrote the playbook of power itself. Think of it as a brutal laboratory where the medieval world tested its limits, where longbows toppled knights, where a peasant girl outmaneuvered empires, and where gunpowder's roar announced the birth of a new age. But beyond the blood and glory, these campaigns whispered timeless lessons. Crécy taught us that adaptability trumps tradition, that a humble archer with a yew bow could humble a nobleman in gilded armor. Agincourt revealed how desperation, when channeled into discipline, can defy impossible odds. Joan of Arc's meteoric rise and fall reminded us that faith and conviction can move armies, yet also how quickly the world discards its prophets. And Castillon, it was the thunderclap that heralded modernity, where artillery's cold logic eclipsed the romance of chivalry. These stories aren't locked in the past. They pulse through our present. The war's legacy lives in the nation-states it forged, the professional armies it inspired, and even in the way we still wrestle with questions of identity and belonging. When we see leaders today clinging to outdated tactics or underestimating the power of symbols, we might as well be watching the French knights charging into English arrows at Poitiers. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and the 100 Years' War gave us some of its most haunting verses. So what's your take? Which campaign left the deepest mark on you? Was it the Black Prince's ruthless chevauchés, Henry V's gritty triumphs, or Joan's defiant stand at Orléans? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to keep the conversation going. And if you've enjoyed this deep dive into medieval warfare, don't forget to like and subscribe for more journeys through history's most pivotal moments. Until next time, remember, the past isn't just a collection of dates and dust. It's a mirror reflecting back the timeless struggles and triumphs that still shape our world today. Keep exploring, and who knows, you might just find the keys to understanding tomorrow hidden in the battles of yesterday.